The experiment had gone wrong from the very beginning, though Ainz would not realize this until it was far too late to matter. The crystalline fragment rested upon the obsidian table in his private laboratory, pulsing with a luminescence that seemed to exist between colors rather than as any specific hue. It had been recovered 3 weeks prior from a dungeon in the New World, extracted from what the local adventurers called a mana vein, but which resonated with properties entirely foreign to anything Ainz had encountered in YGG Drassel. The substance defied categorization. It was not precisely arcane, not quite elemental, and certainly not aligned with any school of magic he had mastered across his decades of gameplay and subsequent years of actual existence as an undead overlord. Ainz had approached the analysis with his characteristic caution, the same methodical paranoia that had kept Nazarick intact through countless potential disasters. He had cordoned off this section of the 9th floor, erected multiple barriers of protection, and ensured that only he would bear the consequences of any miscalculation. The Great Tomb had survived his leadership this long precisely because he refused to gamble with the lives of those who depended upon him, even if those lives were technically those of NPCs elevated to true consciousness through means he still did not fully understand. The fragment responded to death magic in ways that fascinated and troubled him. When he channeled negative energy into its structure, the crystal did not absorb or reflect the power as normal matter would. Instead, it seemed to translate the energy, converting it into something adjacent but fundamentally different. Ainz had documented 17 distinct transformations over the past week, each producing a variant form of magical energy that existed nowhere in his encyclopedic knowledge of YGG Drassel systems. Tonight's experiment had been meant as a final test before he sealed the fragment away in Nazarick's treasury. He had theorized that introducing arcane energy simultaneously with death magic might reveal the crystal's true nature, provide some insight into the underlying principles governing this New World's seemingly chaotic magical framework. The test had required precise timing, exact ratios of power, and absolute control over both energy streams. Ainz had executed the procedure flawlessly. That was what made the result so profoundly disturbing. The moment both energies made contact with the crystal's surface, the fragment had ceased pulsing. For exactly 3 seconds, it had gone completely inert, and Ainz had felt the faint stirring of relief. Then reality itself had begun to tear. The rift started as a hairline fracture in the air, above the laboratory table no wider than a strand of spider silk and easily dismissed as an optical illusion. But Ainz's undead senses perceived what mortal eyes might have missed. The fracture was not simply a visual phenomenon. Space itself was splitting the fundamental fabric of existence, pulling apart like rotted cloth beneath invisible fingers. The tear widened with inexorable patience, expanding from a crack to a fissure, to a wound in reality that spilled light of colors that should not exist into his carefully controlled laboratory. Ainz attempted to halt the process immediately. He severed his connection to both energy streams, erected barriers of containment, and even resorted to using a precious scroll of dimensional lock that he had been saving for emergencies of the highest order. Nothing worked. The rift continued to grow completely independent of his actions, feeding upon some internal logic that operated outside the rules he understood. The dimensions of the tear stabilized at roughly 3 meters in height and 2 in width, forming an irregular oval that hung suspended in midair like a window into somewhere else. Through the opening, Ainz could perceive fragmentary images. Twilight forest, violet-tinged shadows, the suggestion of massive trees that dwarfed even the largest specimens he had encountered in the New World. The perspective shifted and swam as though he were viewing the scene through water. But the location was undeniably real and undeniably elsewhere. More concerning than the visual anomaly was the magical signature emanating from the rift. It carried traces of death magic, yes, but also arcane energy in concentrations that suggested a world saturated with magical power, on a scale that made even YGG Drassel's most mana-rich zones seem barren by comparison. And woven through both signatures was something else, entirely a form of energy Ainz had never encountered, primal and ancient and aware in ways that made his non-existent spine prickle with instinctive dread. The experiment had been intended as a private investigation. It ended as something else entirely. Albedo arrived within minutes, her usual grace abandoned in favor of speed as she materialized in the laboratory with Mare and several of the Pleiades in tow. Their faces, normally composed into perfect masks of devoted service, showed genuine alarm. The rift's magical signature had apparently been powerful enough to trigger Nazarik's deepest wards, the ones reserved for threats to the tomb's very existence. Ainz forced himself to remain still, to project an aura of calm authority, even as his mind raced through increasingly desperate contingencies. He could not afford to show weakness, not when his subordinates looked to him for guidance in all things. The NPCs believed him to be a being of supreme intellect and power, a ruler whose plans encompassed possibilities far beyond their comprehension. The truth that he was a salaryman from Tokyo, fumbling through each crisis with a combination of luck and frantic improvisation, could never be revealed. Ainz-sama. Albedo's voice carried layers of concern beneath its professional veneer. Her golden eyes fixed upon the rift, with an intensity that suggested she was analyzing every aspect of its structure simultaneously. This portal, it does not match any known transportation magic. The energy signature suggests a connection between worlds, but the destination appears to be neither the new world nor Yggdrasil. Ainz had reached the same conclusion, though he appreciated her confirmation. The rift represented something unprecedented, a bridge to a third reality that existed parallel to both the world he had come from and the one he currently inhabited. The implications were staggering and almost entirely negative. If entities from this other world could travel through the rift as easily as he might step through its opening, Nazarik could face threats for which he had no preparation and no defense. Demiurge has been summoned, Mare added quietly, his usual stutter absent in the face of genuine crisis. He is analyzing the magical structure from the 7th floor. Cositis and Shaltir are preparing defensive formations in case something emerges from the portal. The news should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled Ainz with a familiar sense of events spiraling beyond his control. His subordinates were efficient, loyal, and devastatingly competent at their assigned tasks. They were also absolutely convinced that he operated according to plans of vast complexity and breathtaking scope. When Demiurge arrived, he would undoubtedly divine some profound intention behind the rift's creation, would praise Ainz's genius for engineering a gateway to new conquests, would elaborate upon strategies that existed only in the demon's brilliant and thoroughly misguided imagination. Ainz would be forced to maintain the deception, to nod sagely, and allow his advisors to explain his own actions back to him, because the alternative, admitting that he had simply made a catastrophic mistake, was unthinkable. This portal is stable, he announced, infusing his voice with a confidence he absolutely did not feel. I have successfully established a connection to another reality. The magical principles involved are complex, but the result is precisely as intended. The lie came easily after years of practice. Albedo's expression shifted from concern to admiration so quickly that Ainz felt a pang of guilt for the deception. She clasped her hands together, her wings trembling with barely suppressed excitement. Then Ainz-sama has truly transcended even the boundaries between worlds, she breathed. Your wisdom continues to surpass all comprehension. This gateway represents an opportunity for Nazarik to expand our influence across not merely one reality, but multiple dimensions. Ainz wanted to scream, He settled for nodding slowly, as though her words merely confirmed what he had already known. The skull that served as his face made it impossible for his expression to betray the panic churning through his thoughts. Demiurge arrived moments later, his analytical mind already constructing frameworks of intention around what he observed. The demon circled the rift with predatory focus, occasionally extending a clawed hand to test the boundaries of the portal without actually touching its surface. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of certainty that Ainz had learned to dread. "Magnificent," Demiurge murmured. Ainz Sama has not merely opened a gateway to another world. You have established a strategic foothold for expansion, a means by which Nazarick can extend its reach beyond the limitations of this single reality. The implications are profound. If we can secure this portal and explore the world beyond, we will have access to resources, knowledge, and potential allies or subjects that exist completely outside the awareness of any local powers. Ainz listened to Demiurge's analysis with growing resignation. The demon was already constructing an entire campaign around an accident, attributing strategic brilliance to what had been simple curiosity, gone catastrophically wrong. Within minutes, Demiurge had outlined preliminary plans for reconnaissance, resource evaluation, and potential colonization of whatever lay beyond the rift. However, Demiurge continued, his expression growing thoughtful. We must proceed with appropriate caution. This world's magical signature suggests the presence of entities operating at power levels comparable to or potentially exceeding what we might encounter in the new world. I recommend that our initial exploration be conducted discreetly, gathering intelligence before revealing Nazarick's presence. For once, Demiurge's suggestion aligned perfectly with Ainz's own instincts. Caution was always preferable to reckless aggression, particularly when dealing with complete unknowns. If this other world did contain threats capable of harming Nazarick, better to identify them from a position of concealment than to announce their presence and invite retaliation. Your assessment is sound. Ainz replied, grateful for the opportunity to endorse a plan that actually made sense. I will conduct the initial reconnaissance personally. My abilities are best suited for gathering information while remaining undetected. Albedo immediately moved to protest, her protective instincts overwhelming her usual deference. Ainz Sama, please reconsider. To risk yourself on an exploratory mission when we have countless subordinates who could... No. Ainz kept his voice gentle but firm. This world's energy signature is unique. I must understand its nature personally if I am to properly evaluate the strategic possibilities Demiurge has outlined. Additionally, my presence will not be recognized in this other reality. I can investigate without immediately revealing Nazarick's existence or capabilities. It was a reasonable argument, and more importantly, it was true. Ainz genuinely did need to understand what lay beyond the rift, and his own power set included numerous abilities suited for stealth and information gathering. The fact that he also wanted to fix this disaster personally before his subordinates could make it worse through their well-intentioned but often excessive interventions remained unspoken. Albedo yielded with visible reluctance, though her expression promised future arguments on the subject. Then at minimum, allow me to establish defensive protocols around the portal. If anything attempts to emerge from the other side while you are conducting your investigation, Nazarick must be prepared to respond with overwhelming force. Ainz agreed to this easily enough. Defensive preparations were sensible, and they would keep his subordinates occupied with productive tasks, rather than developing increasingly elaborate theories about his non-existent master plan. He made arrangements for his absence, established communication protocols in case of emergency, and prepared the equipment he would need for extended reconnaissance in an unknown world. The persona of Momon would serve him well for this investigation. The dark warrior identity he had cultivated in the new world provided excellent cover for exploration, allowing him to present as a skilled adventurer rather than an undead overlord of incalculable power. He retrieved the enchanted armor and great swords from his personal quarters, checking each piece of equipment with practiced efficiency. As he prepared to step through the rift, Ainz paused to consider the fragment that had started this entire cascade. The crystal sat inert upon the laboratory table, its internal light dimmed to near invisibility. Whatever properties it possessed had apparently been exhausted in the creation of the portal. He would have it sealed away, upon his return locked in the deepest vaults where its strange energies could cause no further chaos. The rift hung before him like an accusation, a visible manifestation of his lack of understanding and control. Ainz studied its swirling boundaries one final time, gathering what courage he possessed, and stepped forward into the unknown. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. One moment he stood in Nazarik's familiar laboratory, surrounded by the predictable architecture of the tomb he had come to know in exhaustive detail. The next he emerged into a forest glade bathed in perpetual twilight, massive trees rising around him like the pillars of some ancient cathedral. The air tasted different here, laden with magical energies, so dense they were almost physical. Ainz's undead senses cataloged a dozen distinct types of mana, in the first few seconds arcane natural shadow, and others he could not immediately identify. The forest itself seemed alive in ways that went beyond normal ecosystems. The trees were aware of his presence, their attention palpable even if they lacked conventional consciousness. Ancient and patient and utterly alien. They watched with the indifference of beings that measured time in centuries rather than years. Ainz moved cautiously through the undergrowth, his armor's enchantments muting any sound his passage might have made. The glade opened onto a wider expanse of forest violet shadows pooling between trees whose bark seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In the distance, he could hear running water and the calls of creatures that sounded similar to birds, but whose cries carried harmonics that suggested they were something else entirely. He had traveled perhaps half a kilometer when the first indication of civilization appeared a dirt path well-maintained and obviously used with some frequency. Ainz studied the tracks pressed into the earth hoof prints from mounts boot prints from humanoid travelers, the occasional deeper impression that suggested heavy carts. The path led toward what appeared to be cleared land areas where the forest's oppressive presence had been deliberately pushed back. The investigation was proceeding smoothly. Ainz felt cautiously optimistic that he might gather useful intelligence and return to Nazarik without incident. This hope lasted exactly as long as it took for the world itself to react to his presence. The wave of energy that rippled outward from the rift's location was not something Ainz had anticipated or could have prevented. It spread like rings on a pond, invisible, but powerfully felt by anyone or anything sensitive to magical fluctuations. The pulse carried echoes of death magic and arcane power, mixed with the strange resonance of the crystal that had initiated the whole cascade. To beings attuned to such energies, it would register as an anomaly of the highest order, a wrongness that demanded investigation. Ainz felt the pulse pass through him and recognized it for what it was. A beacon announcing his arrival to every magic-sensitive entity within range. He had not triggered it intentionally, had not even known such a thing would occur, but the damage was done. Whatever stealth he had hoped to maintain was compromised before he could take meaningful action to preserve it. In a stone chamber thousands of miles to the north, a cult leader paused in his meditation, head tilting as he perceived something that should not exist. The sensation carried echoes of the old gods his orders served, whispers of void and shadow that promised power to those wise enough to seek it. He smiled slowly, sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light, and began issuing orders to his subordinates. In a fortress of ice and stone, a council of death knights felt the ripple of unfamiliar death magic and exchanged glances of concern. The energy signature was wrong, operating according to principles that did not align with the Scourge's understood frameworks. Their leader, a warrior who had broken free from the Lich King's control through strength of will alone, made a decision that would have consequences far beyond his ability to anticipate. In towers of learning scattered across multiple continents, mages attuned to arcane energies detected the anomaly and began investigating its source. Reports filtered upward through hierarchies of authority, reaching individuals with the power and curiosity to demand answers. Ainz, standing alone in a twilight forest on a world he did not know, felt the weight of attention settling upon him like a physical force. He had come here seeking information and intending to remain undetected. Instead, he had announced his presence to forces he could not identify and could not assess. The experiment had definitely gone wrong, and it was only beginning. The forest of Ashenvale operated according to rhythms that predated most civilizations on AzeRoth. Ancient beyond measure, its trees had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the sundering of continents, the slow turning of ages that transformed gods into myths and myths into half-remembered legends. The forest remembered when night elves had been immortal, when the world had been young, and magic had flowed freely without the scars that war and cataclysm had carved into reality's fabric. It did not welcome the presence that had emerged from the rift. Ainz felt the forest's attention like pressure against his consciousness, not quite hostile, but profoundly wary. The trees were aware of him in ways that transcended normal plant life, their roots communicating through networks of fungal connections that spanned kilometers. They recognized him as something fundamentally wrong, a being whose very existence contradicted the natural order they had spent millennia maintaining. He was death-given form and purpose, animated bone wrapped in arcane power. And the forest knew instinctively that his presence represented change of a type it had not encountered in centuries. He moved carefully through the undergrowth, maintaining the persona of Momon with practiced ease. The enchanted armor clinked softly with each step, despite the magical silencing just enough sound to suggest a warrior traveling with reasonable caution rather than supernatural stealth. The twin greatswords on his back completed the image, a powerful adventurer, perhaps, or a wandering mercenary seeking employment in lands far from home. Nothing about his appearance should suggest the truth of what he was or where he had come from. The path he followed wound deeper into the forest, occasionally branching toward what appeared to be settlements or outposts. Ainz avoided these divergences, preferring to gather information through observation before risking direct contact with the local inhabitants. His earlier optimism about remaining undetected had evaporated entirely. The energy pulse from the rift had already announced his presence to forces unknown. Better to understand the nature of this world before attempting to navigate its political and social structures. The magical saturation of the environment continued to fascinate him. Ainz's undead senses cataloged variations in mana density with each kilometer, traveled mapping patterns that suggested deliberate cultivation or natural convergence points. Certain trees practically radiated power, their bark inscribed with runes that glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight. Wells of arcane energy bubbled up from underground sources, creating pools of liquid magic that shimmered with colors that had no names in any language Ainz knew. He paused beside one such pool, studying its surface with professional interest. The liquid responded to his proximity, ripples spreading outward, despite the absence of any physical disturbance. Fascinating. The magic here possessed a level of environmental awareness that went beyond anything he had encountered in either YGG, Drassel, or the New World. It was as though reality itself was alive, conscious, and capable of reacting to external stimuli. A sound interrupted his analysis, voices approaching from deeper in the forest. Ainz moved instantly, his form blurring as he activated Perfect Unknowable and positioned himself within the shadow of a massive tree. The spell would render him completely undetectable to any being below level 100, and he very much doubted this world contained entities operating at that particular threshold. The speakers emerged into view moments later, and Ainz felt his assessment of this world's inhabitants shift dramatically. They were humanoid, but clearly not human. their features too refined and their proportions too perfect to be products of normal evolution. Tall and slender, with skin that ranged from violet to deep blue, they moved through the forest with the unconscious grace of beings completely at home in their environment. Their eyes glowed with internal luminescence shifting between shades of silver and amber, depending on the angle of observation. Night elves. The term rose unbidden from some corner of his mind, accompanied by fragmentary impressions of ancient lore and cultural practices. He had no conscious memory of learning. The knowledge felt transplanted, as though it had been inserted into his thoughts by an external source. Ainz filed the sensation away for later analysis and focused on the conversation unfolding before him. The disturbance originated somewhere near the old shrine, one of the elves was saying, her voice carrying the crisp precision of a military report. Our sentries detected the energy surge approximately 3 hours past sunset. The signature does not match any known magical school, neither druidic nor arcane in the conventional sense. Her companion, a male elf carrying a bow that seemed to be carved from living wood, frowned deeply. Could it be horde activity they have been pushing deeper into Ashenvale lately, testing our defenses? Unlikely. The horde's shamanic magic has a distinct resonance, and their warlocks announce their presence through fell corruption. This was something else entirely. Something... She paused, searching for the right word. Wrong. As though reality itself had been torn and poorly mended. Ainz listened with growing concern. The elves were describing the rift's opening with uncomfortable accuracy, and their awareness of the event's magical signature suggested a level of sensitivity that could prove problematic. If local authorities were already investigating, his window for undetected reconnaissance was closing rapidly. The conversation continued as the elves moved past his position, their voices fading into the ambient sounds of the forest. Ainz waited a full minute after they disappeared from sight before dismissing perfect unknowable and resuming his exploration. The encounter had provided valuable intelligence. This world possessed organized civilizations with military structures and magical expertise. They were engaged in some form of ongoing conflict, and they had already detected the rift's creation. He needed more information, preferably before accidentally inserting himself into whatever political situation governed this region. The forest began to thin after another kilometer of travel, the massive trees giving way to smaller specimens, and eventually to cleared land. Ainz approached the transition zone cautiously, using the remaining cover to observe what lay beyond. What he saw confirmed his assessment of this world's development level, while simultaneously raising new questions. A village spread across the cleared area, its buildings constructed from materials that blended seamlessly with the surrounding environment. Homes built from living wood, their walls formed by trees that had been coaxed into specific shapes rather than cut and assembled. Gardens that produced food through cooperation between cultivator and plant, rather than domination of one by the other. The architecture spoke of a civilization that had learned to work with nature rather than against it, achieving technological sophistication through harmony rather than conquest. The village's inhabitants moved about their daily activities with the calm efficiency of people living in relative peace. Ainz observed farmers tending to crops that glowed faintly with magical enhancement, craftsmen working metal that responded to their tools with unnatural pliability, and children playing games that involved levitation and minor illusions, as casually as human children might throw a ball. This was not a primitive society. These people commanded power and knowledge that rivaled anything he had encountered in the New World, and they did so with the casual competence of a culture that had been practicing such arts for thousands of years. Ainz was considering his next move when the screaming started. The attack came from the forest's edge opposite his position. Figures in robes of purple and black emerged from the tree line, their movements coordinated and their intentions unmistakably hostile. They wielded magic of a type that made Ainz's undead instincts recoil void. Energy, shadow, corruption, power. drawn from sources that existed outside conventional reality. The villagers responded with admirable speed, but they were clearly unprepared for an assault of this magnitude. One of the attackers raised both hands, and the air above the village square twisted into a portal, from which tentacles emerged, writhing appendages covered in eyes that wept black ichor. The villagers' defensive spells splashed against the tentacles ineffectively, their nature-based magic unable to properly interact with entities that violated natural law by their very existence. Ainz observed the unfolding chaos with clinical detachment. This was not his fight, and intervening would reveal his presence to both sides. The tactically sound decision was to remain hidden, gather what information he could from observing the conflict, and withdraw before either faction became aware of his existence. The problem was that Ainz Ooal had never been particularly good at making tactically sound decisions when people were dying in front of him. He moved before conscious thought could stop him, his armored form blurring across the open ground with speed that defied the weight of his equipment. One of the cultists saw him coming and attempted to redirect his spell, but Ainz was already inside the man's guard. The great sword he carried was largely decorative, more useful for maintaining his disguise than for actual combat, but it served its purpose well enough. The blade took the cultist in the chest with force sufficient to shatter ribs and puncture organs, and the man went down without a sound. The battle's tempo shifted instantly. The villagers who had been on the verge of being overwhelmed found themselves with an unexpected ally. The cultists, who had been coordinating their assault with practiced efficiency, suddenly had to account for a variable they had not anticipated. Ainz pressed his advantage ruthlessly, moving through the enemy formation with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent years mastering combat tactics in environments far more complex than this simple ambush. He limited himself carefully, using only physical attacks and avoiding any overtly magical abilities that might reveal his true nature. The great sword sang through the air, their enchanted edges cutting through corrupted flesh and banishing summoned entities with equal efficiency. Ainz danced between attacks, his undead reflexes allowing him to process and react to threats with superhuman speed, while maintaining the appearance of a skilled but fundamentally human warrior. The tentacled horror proved more challenging. It lashed out with appendages that could shatter stone, its multiple eyes fixing on Ainz with an intelligence that suggested something more than mindless summoning. One tentacle wrapped around his arm, and Ainz felt the corrupting energy trying to sink into his armor, seeking the flesh beneath that it assumed must exist. He severed the limb with a calculated strike and drove forward, plunging one sword directly into the creature's central mass. The entity shrieked a sound that existed somewhere between dimensions, audible as much to the mind as to the ear, and began to dissolve. Whatever power had anchored it to this reality was disrupted by the enchantments woven through Ainz's weapon, and it retreated through its portal in a cascade of dissolving tissue. The remaining cultists, seeing their primary weapon banished and their numbers significantly reduced, chose discretion over valor. They withdrew into the forest with surprising discipline, leaving behind only their dead and the lingering taint of void corruption that would take days to fully dissipate. Ainz stood in the village square, breathing hard despite having no lungs to require oxygen, and considered the magnitude of what he had just done. He had meant to observe, to gather intelligence without revealing himself to understand this world before making contact with its inhabitants. Instead, he had inserted himself directly into a conflict he did not understand, revealed his combat capabilities to witnesses he could not control, and very likely set in motion consequences he would not anticipate until far too late to prevent them. The villagers approached him cautiously, their earlier terror replaced by a mixture of gratitude and wariness. One of them, an elderly elf whose robes marked her as someone of authority, stepped forward and inclined her head in a gesture that seemed to indicate respect. "Stranger," she said, her voice carrying the weight of formal address, "you have our gratitude. Those cultists have been growing bolder, but never have they struck so close to our homes. Your intervention saved many lives this day. Ainz inclined his own head in response, buying himself time to formulate an appropriate reply. What did one say in such circumstances? The correct approach would be to maintain his cover as a wandering warrior, deflect Satstra questions about his origins, and extract himself from the situation as quickly as possible. Simple, straightforward, and completely at odds with the way the villagers were looking at him as though he were a hero, rather than an undead monster playing dress-up. "I happen to be nearby," he said finally, keeping his voice neutral and his words carefully vague. "Those attackers, what were they?" The elderly elf's expression darkened. "Twilight's hammer. A cult that serves powers best left unnamed. They worship entities that exist beyond our reality, beings of void and madness that seek to unmake creation itself. Their presence in Ashenvale has been increasing, but we had not realized they had grown bold enough for daylight attacks on established settlements." Ainz filed the information away, noting the parallels to certain entities he had encountered in YGG Dracel. Void entities, reality warping powers, cultists seeking to summon forces beyond conventional understanding. The framework was familiar, even if the specific details differed. "You are not from these lands," the elf continued, and it was not quite a question. "Your armor is of a style I do not recognize, and your fighting technique suggests training from far beyond Kalimdor's shores. What brings a warrior of your skill to Ashenvale? A lie would be transparent. A truth would be catastrophic." Ainz settled for something in between a statement that was accurate without being informative. "I am exploring," he said, "seeking to understand lands I have not previously traveled. The attack interrupted my journey. It was weak, but it would have to suffice." The elf studied him for a long moment, her glowing eyes seeming to pierce through armor and flesh, to examine whatever lay beneath. Then, apparently satisfied with what she saw, or perhaps simply too grateful to press too hard, she nodded. "Then you have our thanks, traveler, and our hospitality should you choose to accept it. Astranar lies a day's journey north, and the Sentinel commander there would wish to hear of what transpired here. The road is dangerous, but less so for one of your capabilities." Ainz accepted the suggestion, recognizing it for the polite dismissal it was. The villagers wanted him gone, grateful for his intervention, but uncomfortable with his continued presence. He could not blame them. He had appeared from nowhere, slaughtered a dozen cultists with disturbing efficiency, and shown no sign of injury, despite engaging an entity that had terrorized them. They viewed him as useful, but potentially dangerous, and they wanted him pointed elsewhere, before that danger became their problem. He departed the village within the hour, following the road north toward this Astranar settlement. Behind him, the villagers would be composing reports, sending messages, and spreading word of the mysterious warrior who had appeared during their darkest moment. The information would travel through whatever communication networks governed this society, reaching ears and eyes that Ainz could not anticipate. The reconnaissance mission was thoroughly compromised. His presence was known, his capabilities had been displayed, and he had involved himself in local conflicts without understanding their broader context. Demiurge would somehow interpret this as strategic brilliance. Albedo would worry about his safety, and Ainz himself would be left managing consequences he had not intended and could not fully predict. As he walked through the twilight forest, Ainz wondered, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, how it was possible to possess godlike power and supreme authority while feeling so consistently, profoundly out of his depth. The forest offered no answers, only the rustling of ancient leaves and the weight of attention from eyes he could not see. News traveled quickly in Ashenvale, carried by runners whose enchanted boots allowed them to traverse distances in hours that would take normal travelers days. By animal companions whose minds linked directly with their druidic partners, and by magical communications that flickered through ancient networks of ley lines connecting settlement to settlement. The account of the mysterious warrior who had appeared during the Twilight's hammer attack reached Astronar before Ainz himself arrived, spreading through the Sentinel garrison like wildfire through dry timber. By the time he approached the outpost's wooden palisades, 3 different versions of the story had already circulated among the guards, each embellished with details that bore only passing resemblance to actual events. In one telling, he had single-handedly slaughtered 30 cultists. In another, he had banished a manifestation of Chithun itself. The third suggested he was an avatar of a loon sent to protect her children in their hour of need. Ainz, unaware of the legends already forming around his intervention, simply wanted to gather information and avoid further complications. The sentinel who met him at the gate possessed the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the wariness of a career soldier who had survived through caution rather than recklessness. She studied Ainz with eyes that catalogued every detail of his appearance, from the unusual styling of his armor to the way he carried his weapons with the unconscious ease of long familiarity. "You are the one they are calling the Dark Warrior," she said, and it was not a question. "Word of your actions in the village reached us this morning." The elder sent a detailed report. Ainz inclined his head, maintaining the persona of the stoic mercenary with practiced ease. "I happened to be present when the attack occurred. Nothing more, nothing more." The sentinel's tone suggested skepticism. A lone warrior appears from nowhere, defeats a Twilight's hammer assault force that included a void manifestation, and disappears northward without requesting payment or recognition. Forgive me if I find such modesty unusual. There was an art to deflecting questions without appearing evasive, and Ainz had been forced to master it during his years leading Nazarick. He met the sentinel's gaze steadily, allowing silence to stretch just long enough to suggest confidence rather than uncertainty. "I am a traveler," he said finally. "The cultists attacked innocents. I responded. What would you have had me do? Stand aside and watch?" The sentinel's expression shifted slightly, some of the wariness replaced by grudging respect. "No, I suppose not." She gestured toward the garrison's interior. "Commander Jaylene will want to speak with you. We have been tracking Twilight's hammer movements for weeks, but their operations have become increasingly coordinated. Any intelligence you can provide about their capabilities would be valuable." Ainz followed her through the outpost, noting the military precision with which the settlement had been organized. Astronar was not merely a way station, but a forward operating base positioned to monitor and respond to threats emerging from Ashenvale's depths. Sentinels drilled in the practice yards, their movements flowing through combat forms with the fluid grace unique to their kind. Hippogriffs roosted in elevated platforms, their riders maintaining equipment and reviewing patrol routes. Everything spoke of a professional military force operating at a high state of readiness. Commander Jaylene proved to be a night elf of middle years, whose bearing suggested extensive combat experience. She received Ainz in a command tent, whose interior was dominated by maps of Ashenvale and surrounding regions, each marked with symbols indicating known threats, patrol routes, and areas of concern. The Twilight's hammer presence was represented by purple markers clustered in disturbing concentrations throughout the forest. "The Dark Warrior," Jaylene said, studying Ainz with the same assessing intensity as her subordinate. "An appropriately dramatic title, though. I understand you did not choose it yourself. Please sit. We have much to discuss." Ainz settled into the offered chair, grateful that his undead nature eliminated the normal tells of nervousness that might have betrayed his discomfort. Jaylene was intelligent and experienced exactly the type of individual most likely to see through inadequate deceptions. He would need to be careful. "The village attack represents an escalation." Jaylene continued, spreading a detailed map across the table between them. "Twilight's hammer has been active in Ashenvale for years, but they typically restrict themselves to remote locations, avoiding direct confrontation with established settlements. This assault suggests either desperation or increased confidence in their capabilities, or both. Ainz offered drawing on his experience with similar cults in Yggdrasil and the New World. Organizations serving entities beyond normal reality often experience both simultaneously. They become desperate to prove their worth to their masters while drawing power that makes them overconfident in their abilities. Jeline's expression sharpened with interest. You speak as though you have encountered such organizations before. Ainz cursed internally, recognizing the slip. He had allowed his analytical instincts to override his caution, providing information that raised questions about his background rather than deflecting them. He recovered as smoothly as possible, keeping his voice neutral. I have traveled widely, he said. Cults worshipping dark powers are unfortunately common across many lands. It was vague enough to be meaningless while technically accurate. Jylene clearly recognized the non-answer for what it was, but she allowed it to pass without further challenge. Instead, she redirected the conversation toward tactical matters, questioning Ainz about the cultists' capabilities, their coordination, and any details he had observed that might prove strategically relevant. Ainz answered carefully, providing accurate information about what he had witnessed, while avoiding any statements that might reveal capabilities or knowledge beyond what a skilled warrior should possess. The cultists had used void magic of intermediate sophistication. Their summoning of the tentacled entity suggested access to entities from beyond normal reality, and their withdrawal discipline indicated professional military training rather than fanatical zealotry. This aligns with intelligence we have been gathering from other sources, Jylene said, making notations on the map. Twilight's hammer is consolidating its presence in Ashenvale, establishing strongholds in the deeper forest, where our patrols rarely venture. We have requested additional support from Darnassus, but resources are stretched thin. The war with the Horde consumes much of our attention. Ainz filed away this reference to ongoing conflict, adding it to his growing understanding of this world's political landscape. A war significant enough to strain resources suggested major factions in sustained combat, which implied complex alliances, territorial disputes, and the sort of chaos that tended to create opportunities for external actors to insert themselves. Not that he intended to insert himself further. He had already become far too visible for comfort. The interview concluded after an hour of detailed questioning, with Jylene offering Ainz the hospitality of the garrison and a suggestion that his skills might be valuable in future operations against the cultists. He deflected, both politely citing his need to continue his travels while remaining deliberately vague about his destination or purpose. As he departed, Astronar Ainz became aware of the attention his presence had attracted. Sentinels watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open admiration. Word of his intervention at the village had clearly spread, and it had been amplified in the telling. He was no longer simply a traveler who had happened upon a conflict, but a warrior of exceptional skill whose arrival in Ashenvale coincided suspiciously with escalating cult activity. The implications were troubling. Ainz had hoped to observe this world discreetly, gathering intelligence that might help him understand the strategic landscape before making decisions about Nazarik's interaction with this new reality. Instead, he had become a person of interest to military authorities, a figure whose actions were being analyzed and whose movements would now be tracked. He was still contemplating this development when the first Horde scouts observed him from the forest's southern edge. The orcs who watched Ainz's departure from Astronar were not part of any official reconnaissance mission. They were hunters from the Warsong clan, ranging ahead of logging operations that pushed deeper into Ashenvale with each passing season. The war between Horde and Alliance had many fronts, and Ashenvale represented one of the most bitterly contested, a grinding conflict over resources and territory that had claimed countless lives on both sides. The hunters had initially been tracking a hippogriff they intended to bring down for meat and hide. Instead, they found themselves witnessing something far more interesting. A warrior in black armor departing the Alliance garrison unmolested, carrying weapons that gleamed with obvious enchantment and moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to combat. The leader of the hunting party, an orc named Gorbak, whose scars told the story of decades spent in battle, watched through the concealment of dense undergrowth as Ainz passed within 50 meters of their position. The warrior's armor was unlike anything Gorbak had seen, neither Alliance standard nor matching the styles favored by mercenary companies that occasionally operated in the region. More significantly, the sentinels at Astranar's gate had offered respectful farewells rather than the contempt typically shown to non-Alliance fighters. "Unknown warrior," Gorbak muttered to his companions. "Leaving Alliance territory but not Alliance himself. This is worth reporting." The youngest of the hunters, an orc barely past his blood trials, frowned in confusion. "Why would we care about one warrior? The Alliance has thousands." Gorbak cuffed the youngster with just enough force to sting. "Because warriors of exceptional skill do not appear randomly in contested territories during wartime. Because the sentinels treated him with respect despite his obvious foreignness. Because information about unusual activities can be the difference between victory and defeat when properly applied." They shadowed Ainz for several hours, maintaining distance, while observing his route and behavior. The warrior seemed to be heading generally south, away from both Alliance and Horde-controlled territories, and deeper into the sections of Ashenvale, where the forest's ancient power ran strongest. He moved with purpose, but without apparent urgency, occasionally pausing to examine plants or geological features with interest that suggested scholarly inclination rather than military reconnaissance. Eventually, Gorbak made the decision to break contact and return to their settlement with the intelligence they had gathered. The warrior was clearly capable. The quality of his equipment and his movement discipline made that obvious, but he did not appear to pose an immediate threat to Horde interests. Still, the information warranted reporting to higher authorities who could make more informed decisions about its significance. By the time the Horde scouts began their return journey, Ainz's encounter at the village and his subsequent meeting with Alliance Command had already become topics of discussion in multiple Horde camps scattered throughout southern Ashenvale. Information from captured Alliance communications reports from their own intelligence network and simple observation of increased Sentinel activity had painted a picture of recent events that intrigued Horde leadership. In Splinter Tree Post, a fortified Horde outpost that served as the primary staging point for operations in Ashenvale, Commander Grim Totem received the initial reports with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding the strategic landscape. A Tauran warrior whose tactical acumen had earned him command despite his relatively young age, Grim Totem had learned to recognize patterns in the chaos of asymmetric warfare. A warrior of unknown origin intervenes in a Twilight's Hammer attack, earns Alliance gratitude, but departs without accepting employment or reward. He summarized, studying the compiled intelligence. This suggests either wealth sufficient to make payment meaningless or motivations that do not align with material compensation. His second-in-command, an orc shaman named Kargra, nodded slowly. The Alliance would not have allowed someone dangerous to depart freely. Their caution with unknown elements is well documented. This warrior must have presented himself as either harmless or potentially valuable as an ally. Or both, Grim Totem added. The reports describe exceptional combat skill but also restraint. He killed only cultists who directly threatened civilians, avoided unnecessary destruction, and departed peacefully when requested. These are not the actions of a simple mercenary seeking employment. Then what are they the actions of? Kargra asked. Grim Totem considered the question, drawing on his understanding of warrior culture that transcended faction boundaries. Honor, discipline. Someone with personal principles that govern their conduct regardless of political affiliation. Such individuals can be valuable allies or dangerous enemies depending on how they interpret their code. The discussion continued, branching into speculation about the warrior's origins, capabilities, and potential impact on the regional balance of power. Ultimately, Grim Totem made the decision to forward the intelligence to higher command in Orgrimmar, while issuing orders to his scouts to locate and observe the mysterious warrior if possible, but to avoid engagement unless directly threatened. "We have enough enemies," he concluded. "No need to create new ones through premature hostility towards someone who has not shown themselves to be a threat." The reports that reached Orgrimmar underwent further analysis by individuals whose responsibilities encompassed not merely regional conflicts, but the Horde's strategic position across multiple continents. Thrall, war chief of the Horde, reviewed the intelligence personally, his shamanic sensitivity to spiritual matters making him particularly attentive to accounts of unusual phenomena. The description of the void entity's banishment interested him greatly. Twilight's hammer represented a threat to both Horde and Alliance, their worship of old gods, and service to void powers, making them enemies of all life on AzeRoth. A warrior capable of disrupting their operations with such effectiveness was potentially valuable, regardless of faction affiliation. This dark warrior, Thrall mused, speaking to Cairn Bloodhoof, who had traveled to Orgrimmar for strategic consultations. The accounts describe someone operating with honor and restraint. These are qualities we respect regardless of their origins. Cairn, whose long life had given him perspective on matters that younger leaders often missed, stroked his beard thoughtfully. The Night Elves would not have treated him with such courtesy if they sensed corruption or malevolence. Their connection to nature allows them to perceive threats that escape normal awareness. If they deemed him safe to release, that judgment carries weight. "Should we attempt contact?" Thrall asked. A warrior of such skill who operates independently of existing factions could be persuaded to aid us, particularly against shared threats like the Twilight's hammer. "Perhaps," Cairn said slowly. "But consider also that such independence may be precisely what makes this individual valuable. The moment we attempt to recruit them, we risk transforming a potential neutral force into an enemy if they perceive our approach as coercion or manipulation. Better perhaps to observe and gather more information before committing to direct action." Thrall accepted this counsel, issuing orders similar to those Grim Totem had already implemented: observe, gather intelligence, but avoid hostile action unless directly threatened. The Horde had learned through bitter experience that premature aggression often created enemies where diplomacy might have forged allies. Meanwhile, Ainz remained completely unaware that both major factions were now analyzing his actions and debating how to respond to his presence. He had continued south from Astranar, moving deeper into regions where civilization's influence faded and the forest's ancient power reasserted itself. His goal was simple: find a location sufficiently remote to establish a temporary camp where he could properly assess the situation without constant risk of observation. The location he eventually selected was a clearing beside a stream whose water ran clear and cold from underground springs. Ancient trees surrounded the space on all sides, their canopy blocking most direct sunlight and creating perpetual twilight, even during what should have been midday. Ainz established basic wards around the perimeter, nothing elaborate enough to attract magical attention, but sufficient to alert him if anything approached. Only then did he allow himself to truly consider the magnitude of his situation. He had come to this world seeking information and intending to remain undetected. Instead, he had involved himself in local conflicts, revealed his combat capabilities to military authorities on both sides of an ongoing war, and become a subject of interest to factions whose nature and intentions he could not properly assess. Demiurge would interpret this as strategic brilliance. Albedo would worry about his safety, and the other floor guardians would likely be preparing military responses to threats that existed only in their collective imaginations. Ainz sat on a fallen log, staring at the stream without really seeing it, and wondered how it was possible to possess supreme power while feeling so consistently overwhelmed by circumstances. In Yggdrasil, he had been a mid-tier player whose success derived from preparation, patience, and willingness to exploit every possible advantage. Those same traits served him well in leading Nazarick, but they could not overcome the fundamental problem of incomplete information. He did not understand. This world's power structures did not know its history. Beyond fragmentary impressions that felt transplanted rather than learned and could not predict how actions he took today might cascade into consequences tomorrow. Every decision felt like navigating through fog, hoping that the path beneath his feet remained solid. A sound interrupted his brooding footsteps, approaching from the northeast, with the careful placement of someone moving through unfamiliar terrain. Ainz rose smoothly, one hand dropping to a sword hilt, while his senses extended to identify the approaching individual. Not hostile. The movement pattern was too cautious, too deliberate. Someone investigating rather than attacking. The figure that emerged into the clearing was human, or at least primarily so. A woman of perhaps 30 years wearing robes that marked her as a mage of some sophistication. She stopped at the clearing's edge, hands raised in a gesture of peaceful intent, and studied Ainz with eyes that glowed faintly with arcane power. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of formal education. "I am Erilyn Dawnseeker, sent from Theramore by Lady Jaina Proudmoore. We received reports of unusual magical phenomena in Ashenvale, and your presence here coincides suspiciously with those reports." Ainz maintained his composure through sheer force of will, his mind racing through implications and potential responses. Theramore, Jaina Proudmoore. Names that carried weight he could sense even without understanding their full significance. The Alliance's intelligence network was apparently more sophisticated than he had anticipated, capable of tracking not merely his physical movements, but correlating them with magical anomalies. "I am a traveler," he said, falling back on the same deflection he had used before. "Nothing more." Erilyn's expression suggested polite skepticism. "A traveler whose arrival coincides with a spatial anomaly that registered across half the continent. A traveler who defeats Twilight's hammer assault forces single-handedly. A traveler whose magical signature does not match any known tradition or school." She paused, letting the implications settle. "Forgive me, but I find such coincidences improbable." The conversation was veering into dangerous territory. Ainz needed to redirect without appearing evasive, to provide enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything truly significant. It was a balance he had maintained countless times in Nazarick, though never with quite such uncertain stakes. "My methods are my own," he said carefully. "I have no quarrel with your Lady Proudmoore or the Alliance she serves. I intervened against the cultists because they attacked innocents. Beyond that, my business is private." Erilyn studied him for a long moment, arcane sight clearly active as she examined him in ways that transcended normal vision. Ainz felt the magical scrutiny washing over his armor, testing his defenses, seeking weaknesses or identifying characteristics. His equipment from YGG Drossel resisted such analysis as a matter of course, its enchantments operating on principles this world could not easily decipher. Finally, she nodded, apparently satisfied, or at least willing to accept his statement at face value. "Lady Jaina wishes you to know that Theramore would welcome allies against the darkness gathering across AzeRoth. The Twilight's hammer is merely one symptom of larger threats. If you are truly as skilled as reports suggest, your aid would be valuable." It was recruitment politely phrased and diplomatically delivered, but recruitment nonetheless. Ainz recognized the pattern from countless similar interactions in both YG Drossel and the New World. Offer friendship, suggest mutual benefit. Imply that refusal might be interpreted as hostility. It was a dance he had learned to navigate, though never with complete comfort. "I will consider Lady Jaina's offer," he said neutrally. "For now, I prefer to operate independently. Should circumstances change, I will know how to make contact." Erilyn accepted this with good grace, providing him with a method for reaching Theramore should he choose to do so in the future. Then she departed, moving back through the forest with the same careful precision she had shown approaching. Ainz waited until her magical signature faded completely before allowing himself to relax. Both the Alliance and Horde were now aware of his existence, interested in his capabilities, and attempting to assess whether he represented opportunity or threat. The situation had escalated beyond his ability to control through simple avoidance. He would need to adapt to find ways of operating in this world that did not continuously attract the attention of major political powers. The problem was that Ainz had never been particularly skilled at avoiding attention. It seemed to find him regardless of his intentions, drawn by some quality he could not identify and could not suppress. He spent the remainder of the day in the clearing, analyzing what he had learned and formulating approaches for the challenges ahead. Night fell slowly in Ashenvale, the perpetual twilight deepening to true darkness as shadows pooled between ancient trees. Ainz sat in meditation, his undead nature eliminating the need for sleep while his mind worked through permutations and possibilities. He did not notice the small sphere of magical energy that manifested briefly at the clearing's edge before vanishing, carrying with it images and impressions that would be analyzed by entities whose interest in his presence went far beyond mere political calculation. The attention of gods was a heavy thing, even when those gods remained unaware of what they observed. Demiurge prided himself on understanding his creator's intentions, on perceiving the subtle layers of strategy that guided every action Ainz Ooal took. The demon had spent countless hours analyzing his master's decisions, constructing frameworks of logic that explained seemingly random choices as components of vast interconnected plans. It was a skill he had cultivated deliberately, knowing that his value to Nazarick lay not merely in tactical competence, but in his ability to anticipate and fulfill objectives that remained unspoken. The rift represented Demiurge's greatest challenge yet. Ainz had created a gateway to another world, established initial contact with local powers, and then departed alone into hostile territory. To anyone else, these actions might appear reckless or impulsive. Demiurge knew better. His master's genius operated on levels that transcended conventional strategic thinking. Every apparent misstep was calculated, every risk carefully weighed against potential benefits. The question was not whether Ainz had a plan. The question was what that plan actually entailed. Demiurge stood in Nazarick's operations center, studying reports compiled from the surveillance network he had established around the rift. Small, nearly undetectable familiars had been dispatched through the portal in carefully staggered deployments, each carrying observation enchantments that fed information back to Nazarick in real time. The intelligence gathered painted a picture of a world far more developed than the New World, with magical traditions that rivaled or exceeded anything encountered during Nazarick's expansion. The local factions have already taken notice of Ainz Sama's presence, Albedo observed, reviewing the same data from her position across the command table. Both this Alliance and Horde have deployed observers. They are analyzing his capabilities and debating how to respond. Precisely as intended. Demiurge replied, his confidence absolute despite having no actual confirmation of Ainz's objectives. Ainz Sama has positioned himself as an unknown variable in their political calculations. By demonstrating power while avoiding explicit factional alignment, he creates uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds caution. Caution provides opportunity. Albedo's expression suggested she was not entirely convinced by this analysis, but she did not challenge it directly. Instead, she raised a different concern. The cult that attacked the village is Twilight's Hammer. They worship entities described as old gods, beings that exist beyond normal reality. Do we have intelligence on their organizational structure? Preliminary information only, Demiurge admitted, gesturing toward one of the surveillance reports. They operate in cells distributed throughout the forest, coordinating their activities through methods we have not yet identified. Their magical practices draw upon void energies similar to certain schools we encountered in YG Dracel, though the underlying principles differ in significant ways. What neither of them mentioned explicitly was the strategic value such an organization might represent. Cults worshipping dark powers were predictable in their fanaticism, easily manipulated through careful application of signs and portents that aligned with their existing beliefs. If one wished to establish influence in a new world without revealing one's true nature, co-opting an existing organization dedicated to serving entities beyond mortal comprehension presented obvious advantages. Demiurge would never presume to act on such possibilities without clear authorization from Ainz. But he could prepare. He could position assets such that when his master inevitably revealed the next phase of his grand design, AzeRoth would be ready to implement whatever brilliant strategy had been conceived. The decision to send imp scouts through the rift was not made lightly. Demiurge selected 3 of his most capable lesser demons creatures whose intelligence and discretion exceeded the norm for their kind. He provided each with specific instructions: observe the Twilight's Hammer cult map, their locations and activities, but under no circumstances reveal themselves or take action that might compromise AzeRoth's security. The imps departed through the rift in the pre-dawn hours when the dimensional barrier between worlds was thinnest and passage required minimal energy. They emerged in Ashenvale's depths, far from any established settlement, and immediately dispersed to begin their reconnaissance. What they discovered over the following days confirmed Demiurge's initial assessments while raising new questions. The Twilight's Hammer operated from hidden sanctums scattered throughout the forest, each site chosen for its proximity to natural convergence points of shadow and void energy. The cultists numbered in the hundreds across all cells, though exact counts proved difficult to establish given their mobility and the distributed nature of their organization. More significantly, the cult's activities suggested they were working towards some specific objective rather than simply spreading chaos for its own sake. They gathered artifacts, performed rituals at specific locations, and maintained communication with entities whose nature the Imp Scouts could not fully discern. Whatever the Twilight's Hammer sought to accomplish, it involved channeling enormous amounts of void energy through carefully prepared conduits. The largest concentration of cultist activity centered on a site deep in Ashenvale's southern reaches, where ancient ruins predated the Night Elves' recorded history. The imps observed this location from concealment, documenting the steady stream of cultists who arrived carrying materials for some great working. The ritual being prepared was complex, requiring components gathered from across the region and arranged according to geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. It was during one such observation that events spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control. One of the Imp Scouts, watching from a position it believed secure, failed to notice a cultist approaching from an unexpected angle. The cultist was a tracker of some skill, following paths through the forest that avoided normal routes, and he spotted the imp's hiding place through a combination of luck and attentiveness. His shout of alarm brought reinforcements within seconds. The imp attempted to flee, relying on its natural abilities to become invisible and escape through shadowy pathways. But the cultists had prepared their sanctum against exactly such intrusions, warding the area with barriers that disrupted dimensional travel and revealed hidden entities. The imp found itself trapped, surrounded by cultists whose void-infused magic proved more than capable of harming demonic entities. It died within minutes, its final moments transmitted back to AzeRoth through the surveillance enchantments that ceased functioning with its destruction. Demiurge received the report with controlled fury. The loss of the imp was regrettable but acceptable. Lesser demons were expendable resources whose sacrifice meant little in strategic terms. What was unacceptable was the implication of that sacrifice. The cultists now knew they were being observed by entities possessing demonic characteristics. They would increase security, alter their patterns, and potentially accelerate whatever plans they were developing, unless Demiurge took immediate action to prevent such responses. The decision formed in his mind with crystalline clarity. Ainz had positioned himself as a variable in this world's political calculations, demonstrating power while maintaining ambiguity about his intentions. The Twilight's Hammer's discovery of demonic surveillance threatened that carefully constructed uncertainty. If the cultists began spreading word of demon spies, it could compromise Nazarik's strategic position. Before Ainz revealed whatever brilliant plan justified his current actions, there was only one logical response: eliminate the threat before it could metastasize. Demiurge assembled a strike force with surgical precision. He would lead it personally, bringing Cocytus to provide overwhelming martial power and selecting support elements from Nazarik's standing forces. The mission parameters were straightforward. Enter through the rift, destroy the Twilight's Hammer sanctum, where the imp had been discovered, eliminate all witnesses, and withdraw before local authorities could respond. Fast, brutal, and complete. Exactly the type of operation Demiurge had executed countless times during Nazarik's expansion through the New World. Albedo objected when informed of the plan. This exceeds your authority. Taking military action in a world we barely understand without explicit authorization from Ainz represents an unacceptable risk. On the contrary, Demiurge replied with absolute confidence. This is precisely what Ainz would expect. He has positioned himself to attract attention from major powers while maintaining strategic ambiguity. Our role is to eliminate complications that might compromise that positioning. The cultists represent such a complication. Their removal serves the broader strategy. You are interpreting actions you do not understand and attributing intentions that may not exist, Albedo said coldly. Ainz went to this world seeking information. You are proposing military escalation. I am protecting Nazarik, Demiurge countered, as are you. The difference is that I recognize the need for proactive measures while you counsel reactive caution. Both approaches have merit, but in this circumstance, action is required. The argument continued for hours, neither willing to yield. Ultimately, Demiurge made the decision unilaterally, invoking his authority as one of Nazarik's chief strategists and accepting full responsibility for any consequences. He would explain his reasoning to Ainz upon the Supreme Being's return, confident that his master's genius would recognize the necessity of what had been done. The strike force departed through the rift under cover of darkness, emerging in Ashenvale, several kilometers from the targeted sanctum. Demiurge had studied the terrain through his surveillance network, identifying approach routes that avoided normal patrol paths, while providing adequate cover for a force of their size. Cocytus led the advance elements, his insectoid form moving through the forest with surprising grace, despite his massive bulk. They reached the sanctum's perimeter within 2 hours, finding it exactly as the imp scouts had reported. Cultists moved between structures erected around the ancient ruins, their activities focused on a central chamber where the primary ritual was being conducted. Guards patrolled the boundaries, but their attention was directed outward, toward potential threats from Alliance or Horde forces, rather than the direction from which Nazarik's assault actually came. Demiurge gave the attack order with clinical precision. Cocytus and his warriors struck first, overwhelming the perimeter guards before they could raise an alarm. The assault penetrated to the sanctum's heart within minutes, demonic and undead forces moving with coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training and absolute discipline. The cultists attempted to mount a defense, rallying around their most powerful members and channeling void energy in desperate counterattacks. It was futile. Nazarik's forces operated at power levels that exceeded anything the Twilight's Hammer had encountered, their martial and magical capabilities honed through conflicts that had claimed the lives of beings far more formidable than these cultists. The sanctum fell within the hour. Demiurge ordered total destruction buildings, raised ritual implements, shattered, and every cultist eliminated without exception. No witnesses could remain to report what had occurred or who had been responsible. The operation needed to appear as though the sanctum had simply been annihilated by an unknown force, leaving no clear evidence of Nazaric's involvement. As the last structures burned, Demiurge surveyed the destruction with satisfaction. The threat had been eliminated, Nazaric's security preserved, and the operation executed with the efficiency expected of forces serving the supreme beings. Ainz would undoubtedly praise such decisive action when the full context was explained. What Demiurge did not realize, could not have anticipated, was that the cultists had interpreted events according to their own framework of belief, rather than objective reality. The surviving Twilight's Hammer members, who had been away from the sanctum during the attack, arrived to find nothing but ruins and corpses. They examined the destruction with growing horror and awe, analyzing the magical signatures left behind by Nazaric's forces. What they found defied their understanding. Death magic of unprecedented purity, demonic energies that operated according to principles their lore did not encompass, and an overall signature that resonated with the void entities they served. To minds already conditioned to see divine intervention in random chance, the conclusion was inescapable. The old gods had acted directly, manifesting their power to punish failure and demonstrate their might. The sanctum had been destroyed not by enemies, but by the very entities the cult served, a message written in blood and ash that could not be misinterpreted. But why? What had prompted such divine wrath? The answer became obvious when they reviewed the sanctum's final reports, the observations made before its destruction. Demon scouts had been discovered, servants of powers beyond mortal comprehension, sent to observe the cult's activities. The sanctum's members had captured and destroyed one such scout, an act of presumption that must have angered the old gods whose plans operated on scales beyond mortal understanding. The destruction was punishment, yes, but also instruction. The old gods had agents in this world, entities serving their ineffable purposes through methods that appeared contradictory, but aligned with cosmic designs too vast for mortal minds to grasp. The demon scouts were not enemies, but fellow servants, and their observation was not intrusion, but divine oversight. More significantly, there was the matter of the Dark Warrior whom multiple cells had been tracking. This Momon, who had appeared coincident with the Great Rift, who wielded death magic with casual mastery, who had intervened against cultists attacking a village with violence, both precise and overwhelming. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The warrior had to be connected to the divine agents, possibly even serving as their mortal instrument. The Twilight's Hammer's leadership, such as it was, convened an emergency session at a hidden location, far from the destroyed sanctum. They debated the implications for hours before reaching consensus. The Dark Warrior was not an enemy, but a herald, possibly even an avatar of the old gods themselves. His intervention at the village had been a test, his destruction of cultists, a culling of the unworthy. The sanctum's annihilation was further proof of divine involvement, a demonstration that the old gods' plans encompassed far more than the Twilight's Hammer had previously understood. They made the decision to adjust their doctrine accordingly. Momon would be honored, rather than opposed, recognized as a chosen instrument of the void. His path would be smoothed, his actions supported, and his presence celebrated as evidence that the old god's return was imminent. Word spread through the Twilight's Hammer's networks with the speed of religious fervor. Within days, every cell operating in Ashenvale and beyond had received the new doctrine. The Dark Warrior was sacred. The demon scouts were divine messengers. The destruction of the sanctum was holy cleansing. All evidence pointed to the old gods manifesting their power directly in preparation for their final victory over the world's false order. Demiurge safely returned to Nazarick, and confident in the success of his operation, remained entirely unaware of the interpretation his actions had spawned. He had eliminated a complication and preserved operational security. The fact that he had simultaneously created a cult that now venerated his master as a divine entity, sent to herald the void's triumph, simply never occurred to him. Ainz, meditating in his forest clearing and trying to formulate a strategy for navigating this world's complex political landscape, felt a familiar sense of dread creeping through his consciousness. Something had happened. He did not know what, could not identify the specific cause, but experience had taught him to recognize the sensation of events spiraling beyond his control. He would discover the full scope of the disaster soon enough. For now, he simply sat in the twilight forest and wondered how it was possible to feel so consistently doomed despite possessing supreme power and the loyalty of forces capable of reshaping continents. The answer, as always, was that power meant nothing without understanding. And understanding was precisely what he lacked. Somewhere in Ashenvale's depths, cultists began erecting a shrine to the Dark Herald, decorating it with symbols drawn from void worship, and offerings meant to honor the avatar who would lead them to glorious ascension. They worked with fervent devotion, certain that their actions aligned with divine will. The misunderstanding was complete, absolute, and utterly irreversible. The Knights of the Ebon Blade existed in a state of permanent contradiction. They were undead, who had reclaimed their free will through sheer force of determination. Warriors who had been enslaved by the Lich King and broken their bonds through courage that transcended death itself. They served no master, but their own conscience fought for causes they chose rather than orders they were compelled to obey, and carried the burden of atrocities committed while their minds were not their own. Darian Mograine understood this contradiction more intimately than most. As High Lord of the Ebon Blade, he bore responsibility for leading warriors who had earned their freedom through suffering and who guarded that freedom with zealous intensity. They would follow him into any battle he deemed just, but they would never again bow to another's absolute authority. The distinction was subtle but absolute. It was this understanding that made the anomaly so deeply troubling. The death magic emanating from southern Ashenvale operated according to principles Darian had never encountered. It was pure in ways that scourge necromancy was not controlled with precision, that suggested mastery rather than brute application of power, and utterly devoid of the Lich King's characteristic taint. Whoever wielded this magic had either discovered techniques that existed completely outside the scourge's accumulated knowledge, or had been trained in traditions that predated Arthas's corruption of necromantic arts. Either possibility demanded investigation. Darian stood in the Ebon Blade's forward outpost, a fortified position established on the border between Ashenvale and the contested territories to the north. The outpost served multiple purposes, monitoring scourge activity, gathering intelligence on threats that might affect Alliance or Horde populations, and maintaining the Ebon Blade's independence from both major factions. They were not Alliance despite their origin in Stormwind's military tradition. They were not Horde despite sharing common cause against the Lich King. They were something else entirely defined by their refusal to be defined. The signature is consistent across multiple detection events, reported Thasarian, one of Darian's most trusted lieutenants. The Death Knight studied magical readings compiled over the past week, his expression thoughtful. Initial manifestation coincided with the spatial anomaly that every mage on the continent detected. Subsequent occurrences correlate with reported sightings of this dark warrior the locals have been discussing. And the most recent event, Darian asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting confirmation. 3 nights passed. A massive surge of death magic in southern Ashenvale, accompanied by demonic signatures and destruction of a Twilight's hammer sanctum. The magical profile matches previous occurrences, but at significantly higher intensity. Whatever entity is responsible escalated from subtle observation to direct military action. Darian considered this information carefully. The Twilight's hammer represented a threat to all life on AzeRoth, their worship of old gods, making them enemies of both living and undead populations. Destroying one of their sanctums was arguably a service to the world. But the methodology raised questions about the entity responsible and their ultimate objectives. Assemble a reconnaissance team, he decided. Experienced knights only individuals who can assess magical threats and engage diplomatically if circumstances warrant. We will investigate this phenomenon directly and determine whether it represents an ally against darkness or simply a different variety of threat. The team departed within hours. 6. Death Knights mounted on skeletal steeds that could traverse the distance to Ashenvale in days rather than weeks. They rode with the grim purpose characteristic of their Order warriors who had seen the worst that death could offer, and emerged determined to prevent others from suffering similar fates. They found evidence of the Dark Warrior's presence long before they encountered the individual himself. Twilight's Hammer cultists in the region had undergone a transformation that defied rational explanation. Where previously they had operated with the paranoid secrecy typical of void-worshipping fanatics, they now moved openly, spreading doctrine about a herald sent by their dark masters to usher in a new age of enlightenment. The Death Knights observed this phenomenon with growing concern. Cults rarely became more brazen without reason, and the change in behavior suggested either desperation or genuine belief in some significant development. They are building shrines, the Sarian reported after scouting ahead. Crude structures but erected with fanatical devotion. Each one dedicated to something they call the Dark Herald, described as an avatar of the void, sent to prepare the world for their god's return. Darian felt cold dread settling into his consciousness, not the physical cold of his undead state, but the psychological chill of recognizing a pattern he had seen before. Cults reacting to the appearance of powerful individuals by incorporating them into existing belief structures. It was how the scourge had spread in its early days, exploiting existing fears and religious frameworks to accelerate its expansion. If the Dark Warrior had deliberately cultivated such worship, he represented a threat of the highest order. If the worship had emerged organically through misinterpretation, the situation was merely catastrophic rather than apocalyptic. They located Momon, 2 days into their search, camped in a clearing that showed signs of extended occupation. The warrior sat in meditation beside a stream, his black armor reflecting the forest's perpetual twilight in ways that suggested enchantments far beyond normal craftsmanship. He appeared to be alone, though the Death Knight's trained senses detected wards around the perimeter that would alert him to any approach. Darian signaled his team to hold position while he advanced alone. The direct approach carried risks, but it also demonstrated peaceful intent in ways that surrounding the camp would not. He moved openly, making no effort at stealth, and stopped at the edge of the clearing where the wards would clearly detect his presence. Momon rose smoothly, one hand dropping to a sword hilt in a gesture that managed to suggest both readiness and restraint. His posture was that of someone accustomed to combat, but not eager for it, a warrior who would fight if necessary, but preferred alternatives when available. "You are far from Ebon Blade territories." Momon observed his voice, carrying the neutral tone of someone assessing a situation before committing to a response. "What brings Death Knights to Ashenvale?" Darian appreciated the directness. "You, or more specifically, the magical signature you carry. Death magic of a purity and control. We have not encountered outside the Scourge's highest circles, wielded by someone who operates independently of any known necromantic tradition. This warrants investigation." "I am a traveler," Momon replied, and Darian recognized the deflection for what it was not quite a lie, but far from a complete truth. "My methods are my own. They pose no threat to your order or its interests." "Perhaps," Darian allowed, "but there is also the matter of the Twilight's Hammer. They have begun worshipping you as some form of divine herald. Cults do not typically venerate individuals unless they have been given reason to believe such veneration is appropriate. The shift in Momon's posture was subtle, but telling a slight stiffening that suggested the news was unwelcome rather than expected. Darian had spent years reading body language through armor and undead flesh that should have been incapable of expression. This warrior had not cultivated cult worship deliberately. The reaction was genuine surprise, mixed with what might have been resignation. "I destroyed a Twilight's hammer cell," Momon said slowly. "They were conducting rituals that threatened local populations." The cultists apparently misinterpreted the intervention as something it was not. "An unfortunate misinterpretation," Darian agreed. "One that will complicate any attempt to operate in this region without attracting further unwanted attention. Cults tend to be enthusiastic about spreading word of their beliefs." Momon's helmet concealed his expression, but his voice carried traces of what might have been dark humor. "I am beginning to understand that. Recent events have demonstrated that good intentions and careful planning rarely survive contact with actual circumstances." Despite himself, Darian felt a flicker of sympathy. He had commanded forces through enough campaigns to recognize the particular frustration of watching situations spiral beyond control despite one's best efforts. This warrior, whoever he truly was, seemed to be experiencing that same phenomenon. "The death magic you wield?" Darian said, redirecting the conversation to his primary concern. "It does not carry the Lich King's taint. Where did you learn to manipulate such forces with that level of purity?" It was the critical question, the one that would determine whether Momon represented potential ally or definite threat. Death Knights were intimately familiar with necromancy in all its forms, from the elegant techniques of ancient Lordaeron to the brutal efficiency of scourge methodology. They could identify corruption, recognize enslavement, and detect the specific signatures that indicated service to entities inimical to free will. Momon was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his words were measured with obvious care. "I was not trained by your Lich King or any affiliated with his power. My understanding of death magic comes from elsewhere. Different traditions operating according to principles that may not align with what you consider standard practice." "Different traditions?" Darian's tone made it clear he recognized the evasion. "There are not many sources of necromantic knowledge on AzeRoth that operate independently of the Scourge. Those that exist are either deeply hidden or have been thoroughly corrupted by powers arguably worse than the Lich King himself." "Then perhaps I am from neither category," Momon suggested. "Perhaps there are traditions and sources of knowledge that exist beyond what AzeRoth considers comprehensive understanding." The implication was staggering. Darian had encountered many things during his existence as a Death Knight, but the suggestion that this warrior came from somewhere outside AzeRoth, entirely somewhere with its own magical traditions and power structures, opened possibilities both fascinating and deeply concerning. Before he could press further, one of his team members called out a warning. Multiple entities approaching from the east, moving with coordinated purpose that suggested military discipline rather than random encounter. Darian's hand dropped to his weapon as he turned to assess the threat. What emerged from this forest made him revise his tactical assessment immediately. Scourge units, a patrol of approximately 20 undead warriors, accompanied by 2 necromancers whose robes bore the Lich King's sigil. They moved in formation, clearly tracking something, and their path would bring them directly to the clearing within minutes. "This is going to complicate matters," Darian observed dryly. Momon had already risen to a combat stance, his twin swords clearing their sheaths with practiced efficiency. "I assume Scourge forces are not known for their willingness to negotiate." "They follow the Lich King's will? Absolutely," Darian confirmed. "If they have been dispatched to investigate the magical anomalies you represent, they will attempt to either recruit or destroy you, depending on their assessment of your capabilities." "And your forces?" Momon asked. "Will you join them or oppose them?" It was a fair question. The Ebon Blade had broken free from the Lich King's control, but they were still composed of warriors who had once served his absolute will. To Scourge units operating under direct command, the Death Knights represented traitors deserving of immediate execution. The feeling was mutual. "We oppose the Scourge in all things," Darian said firmly. "Their attempt to enslave or destroy you makes you an ally in this engagement, however temporary that alliance might prove." The Scourge Patrol entered the clearing with mechanical precision, their formation optimized for dealing with small groups of defenders. The necromancers hung back, analyzing the magical signatures present while their warriors advanced. One of them pointed directly at Momon, his voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "Unknown entity wielding death magic outside Scourge protocols. Capture for interrogation or destroy if resistance proves excessive. Secondary targets, traitor Death Knights, to be eliminated without mercy." Darian felt grim satisfaction at being relegated to secondary target status. It suggested the Scourge's priorities remained as rigid as ever, focused on magical anomalies rather than tactical threats. It was a weakness he intended to exploit. "Form defensive positions," he ordered his team. "Protect the civilian and eliminate Scourge forces. Priority targets are the necromancers." Momon shot him a glance that might have carried amusement. "Civilian, you are not Ebon Blade, not Scourge, and not formally affiliated with any recognized military force," Darian replied. "By definition, that makes you a civilian caught in hostile action. We are obligated to protect you." How considerate. The engagement opened with characteristic Scourge brutality. The undead warriors charged forward in a wall of rusted weapons and corrupted flesh. Their attacks coordinated through the necromancer's mental commands. The Death Knights met them with disciplined violence, their superior equipment and training creating a defensive line that the Scourge could not immediately breach. Momon moved through the chaos with fluid grace that spoke of extensive combat experience. His swords wove patterns that seemed almost artistic in their precision. Each strike placed with calculated efficiency to disable or destroy. Darian observed with professional appreciation this was not someone who relied on overwhelming power to compensate for lack of skill. This was a warrior who had spent years mastering combat technique. More concerning was the magic Momon employed. Death Knights were intimately familiar with necromancy in all its forms. But what this warrior demonstrated went beyond standard applications. He did not simply channel death magic to enhance his physical capabilities or summon undead servants. He manipulated the very essence of mortality itself, creating zones where the boundary between life and death became malleable and subject to his will. A Scourge warrior caught in one such zone simply ceased to exist. Its animating magic dispersed as though it had never been. Another found its corrupted form purified the Lich King's control, stripped away to leave only inert bone and rotting flesh. These were not techniques the Scourge employed. They were something else entirely, operating according to principles that defied Darian's understanding. The necromancers recognized the threat and attempted to counter it. They channeled void corruption, trying to overwhelm Momon's defenses with raw power rather than finesse. It was a mistake. Momon's armor resisted their magic with casual efficiency, the enchantments woven through its construction operating on levels that exceeded anything the Scourge had developed. One of the necromancers managed to manifest a void tendril, a writhing appendage of pure shadow, that reached for Momon with clear intent to corrupt and consume. Momon severed it with a single strike, and the backlash of disrupted magic tore through the necromancer's defenses with devastating force. The Scourge spellcaster collapsed, his concentration broken, and his connection to the Lich King's power severed by trauma. The second necromancer, seeing his companion fall, made the tactical decision to withdraw. He gathered what remained of the patrol, barely half their original number, and retreated with the same mechanical efficiency they had shown approaching. The Scourge did not flee in panic. They simply recognized a losing engagement and adjusted their strategy accordingly. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the dissolution of fallen Scourge warriors, whose animating magic dispersed now that their controllers had withdrawn. Darian surveyed the battlefield, noting casualties among his own forces, 2 Death Knights injured, but mobile, none killed. Moman stood among the carnage, apparently unharmed his armor, showing no sign of the void corruption that should have marked any contact with Scourge magic. That was educational, Darian observed. Your techniques are unlike anything I have encountered in decades of studying necromantic traditions. Where exactly did you say you learned such methods? I did not say, Moman replied. And I suspect you already know that I will not provide details, regardless of how politely you phrase the question. True enough. Darian sheathed his weapon, a gesture of trust that could prove foolish, but felt appropriate given the circumstances. You fought alongside us against the Scourge, by the customs of my order that makes you an ally until circumstances change. We will not press for information you clearly wish to keep private. I appreciate the discretion, Moman said, though I suspect this engagement will attract further attention from all parties interested in unusual magical phenomena. He was correct, of course. The Scourge would report the encounter to their superiors, who would dispatch stronger forces to investigate. The Ebon Blade would be filing their own reports, analyzing what they had witnessed, and debating how to classify this unusual warrior. And somewhere in the shadows, the Twilight's Hammer would be constructing new mythologies around their Dark Herald's latest demonstration of power. Darian considered offering Moman's sanctuary with the Ebon Blade, suggesting that cooperation might serve both their interests. But he recognized the futility of such offers. This warrior operated independently for reasons he clearly considered important, and pushing too hard would only damage whatever fragile trust had been established through shared combat. If you find yourself requiring allies against the Scourge or other threats, Darian said instead, the Ebon Blade can be found in the Northern Territories. We make no demands of those who fight alongside us, only that they share our commitment to opposing tyranny in all its forms. A generous offer, Moman acknowledged. One I will remember should circumstances warrant its acceptance. The Death Knights departed shortly thereafter, riding north toward their outpost, with the wounded secured on their mounts. Darian looked back once, seeing Moman standing alone in the clearing, a solitary figure whose presence in this world raised more questions than it answered. The reports he would file would be thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. An unknown entity wielding death magic of exceptional purity, operating independently of all known factions, demonstrating combat capabilities that exceeded reasonable expectations, and somehow inspiring cult worship, despite apparent attempts to avoid such attention. The Ebon Blade would continue monitoring the situation, but they would not interfere unless the warrior proved to be a genuine threat. Behind them in the shadows at the clearing's edge, other observers withdrew with their own conclusions. Twilight's Hammer scouts had witnessed their herald fighting alongside the Death Knights, demonstrating mastery over undeath itself and banishing Scourge corruption with casual power. The cult's mythology expanded to incorporate this new evidence. The Dark Herald commanded the free undead as allies and opposed the false death of the Lich King with true death granted by the Void. The misunderstandings multiplied each observer, interpreting events through their own framework of belief and understanding. And at the center of it all, Ainz Ooal stood in a forest clearing and contemplated the magnitude of how thoroughly everything had spiraled beyond his control. Demiurge would undoubtedly claim this was all according to plan. Albedo would worry about his safety, and Ainz himself would continue navigating a situation that grew more complicated with each passing day, armed with nothing but improvisational skills and desperate hope that somehow everything would work out before the universe called his bluff. The weight of divine misunderstanding was a heavy burden indeed. The chaos began, as most catastrophes do, with a series of small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The Scourge patrol that had retreated from their engagement with Moman did not simply disappear into the wilderness. They returned to their command structure, filing reports with a mechanical efficiency characteristic of undead operating under absolute control. Those reports traveled up through hierarchies of authority until they reached individuals capable of making strategic decisions rather than simply executing orders. The analysis was straightforward. An unknown entity wielding death magic of exceptional purity had been observed in southern Ashenvale, operating outside Scourge control and demonstrating capabilities that suggested either a new power emerging in the world or an existing force previously overlooked. The entity had allied with the Ebon Blade traders and destroyed Scourge forces with disturbing ease. This warranted immediate investigation and potential elimination. A larger force was dispatched. Not an army. The Lich King's attention was focused elsewhere on conflicts that demanded greater resources, but a substantial patrol capable of overwhelming most conventional resistance. 50 undead warriors, 6 necromancers, and a Death Knight commander who had not broken free from the Lich King's control and never would. They moved south with singular purpose, tracking the magical signature that had become associated with the anomaly. The Twilight's Hammer, having declared Momon their herald, took it upon themselves to protect him from perceived threats. When their scouts reported Scourge forces moving toward the area where their Dark Herald had established his camp, they mobilized with fanatical devotion. If the false death threatened their avatar, they would demonstrate the superiority of true void power. The Ebon Blade, concerned about escalating Scourge activity and genuinely curious about the mysterious warrior they had fought alongside, sent additional observers. Darian had ordered caution, but he had also authorized intervention if circumstances warranted protecting a potential ally from overwhelming force. 3 separate groups, each operating according to their own logic and objectives, converged on southern Ashenvale with no awareness of the other's involvement. The only common element was their focus on a single individual who remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. Ainz was attempting to establish contact with Nazarick when the first warnings reached him. The communication spell was complex, requiring precise calibration to bridge the dimensional gap between worlds. He had been working on the methodology for days, using principles adapted from YGG Drossel's message functions and modified to account for the rift's unusual properties. The spell was nearly complete when his perimeter wards began screaming alerts, multiple groups approaching from different directions. Magical signatures indicating Scourge forces, void corruption, and death magic associated with the Ebon Blade. Ainz dismissed the communication attempt and began calculating escape routes, only to realize with sinking dread that the approaching forces were not simply passing through the area. They were converging on his position specifically. Ainz armed himself with practiced efficiency, abandoning any hope of avoiding confrontation in favor of preparing for combat against numerically superior forces. The situation had deteriorated from complicated to actively dangerous, and he needed to assess whether retreat or engagement offered better survival odds. The decision was made for him when the first elements of the Scourge force emerged from the tree line, followed almost immediately by Twilight's Hammer cultists from the opposite direction. Both groups stopped, clearly surprised to find the other present, and the momentary confusion gave Ainz time to recognize the magnitude of his problem. The cultists saw Scourge forces threatening their herald and immediately attacked, channeling void magic with fanatical intensity. The Scourge, following orders to investigate the anomaly and eliminate resistance, engaged the cultists with mechanical efficiency. And Ainz found himself at the center of a conflict he had not initiated and could not prevent. The Ebon Blade units arrived minutes later, assessing the situation with professional speed and immediately recognizing the tactical disaster unfolding. Scourge and cultists were tearing each other apart in the forest, and their battle was driving inexorably toward the rift's location. The spatial anomaly. Thessarian reported to his commander, via magical communication. If the fighting reaches it, we could have dimensional instability across the entire region. The decision to intervene was made by multiple parties simultaneously, each for different reasons. The Ebon Blade moved to contain the Scourge forces before they could threaten the rift. The Twilight's hammer intensified their assault, convinced they were defending their herald's sacred gateway. The Scourge, recognizing organized resistance, called for reinforcements. Ainz, standing at the center of the expanding chaos, made his own calculation and reached a conclusion he had hoped to avoid. The rift could not be allowed to become a battlefield. If it was damaged or destabilized, the connection to Nazarick might be severed or worse corrupted in ways that allowed hostile forces access to the Great Tomb itself. He had to protect the rift, which meant he had to end the battle decisively before it spread further. The spell he chose was one of his favorites from YGG Drassel. Powerful enough to command attention without revealing his full capabilities. Perfect Warrior transformed him instantly, replacing his undead physiology with a simulacrum of peak physical condition while maintaining his combat skills. His already considerable strength multiplied, and the restrictions on his equipment usage disappeared entirely. Ainz moved into the battle with calculated violence, targeting the Scourge forces first as the most immediate threat to the rift's stability. His sword sang through undead flesh with devastating efficiency, each strike destroying the animating magic that gave the warriors coherence. The Scourge commander recognized him as a primary threat and redirected forces to counter, but Ainz had been fighting battles like this for years. The cultists, seeing their herald engaging the enemy directly, rallied with renewed fervor. They channeled void magic in support, creating zones of corruption that weakened the Scourge, while carefully avoiding areas where Ainz fought. Their devotion was absolute and utterly misguided. But in the immediate tactical situation, it proved tactically useful. The Ebon Blade engaged from the flanks their discipline and superior equipment, creating kill zones that the Scourge could not easily overcome. Darian had arrived personally, and his presence elevated his force's effectiveness significantly. He fought with the controlled fury of someone who had been enslaved and would die before allowing such enslavement to be inflicted on others. The battle's tempo escalated rapidly. More Scourge units arrived as reinforcements drawn by the magical signatures and the commander's reports. More cultists emerged from hiding, convinced this was the prophesied battle that would herald their god's return. The Ebon Blade committed additional forces, recognizing that allowing the Scourge to secure this region would create strategic problems across the entire continent. Ainz found himself fighting in conditions that reminded him uncomfortably of YGG Drassel's massive raids, where coordination between multiple factions created chaos that could only be navigated through constant adaptation. He shifted positions continuously, preventing the Scourge from organizing effective responses, while ensuring his own movements kept combat away from the rift's immediate vicinity. That was when Albedo's voice cut through the chaos transmitted via magic that bypassed normal communication limitations. Ainz-sama, we are detecting massive magical disturbances on your side of the rift. Are you under attack? Ainz wanted to scream. Of course he was under attack. Of course, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Nazarick's detection systems were registering the conflict. And of course, Albedo was now involved, which meant his subordinates would shortly make everything infinitely worse through their well-intentioned interventions. The situation is manageable. He lied, decapitating a Scourge warrior while simultaneously dodging void corruption from an overly enthusiastic cultist. Do not send reinforcements. I repeat, do not. The rift erupted with power as Cocytus led a force of Nazarick's warriors through the gateway, their forms materializing in perfect combat formation. The insectoid warrior's compound eyes took in the battlefield with tactical precision, and his conclusion was immediate. Ainz-sama is under attack by multiple empty factions, engaging all hostile forces immediately. Wait, Ainz began, but Cocytus was already moving his warriors, spreading out with disciplined efficiency that spoke of extensive training and absolute loyalty. What happened next would be analyzed by military scholars for years afterward. though the participants would provide wildly different accounts of the actual events. Nazaric's forces were not numerous. Cocytus had brought perhaps 30 warriors prioritizing quality over quantity. But they operated at power levels that exceeded anything present on the battlefield. Their equipment was forged from materials that should not exist, enchanted with magics, that operated according to principles AzeRoth did not recognize, and wielded by entities whose combat experience encompassed conflicts that had destroyed kingdoms. They moved through the scourge formations like scythes, through wheat, destroying the undead with mechanical precision. The Scourge commander attempted to rally his forces, channeling the Lich King's power to reinforce his warriors' defenses. But Nazaric's weapons simply ignored such protections. They were designed to kill beings far more powerful than animated corpses held together by necromancy. The cultists watched in religious ecstasy as their herald's forces manifested. This was confirmation of everything they believed. The Dark Herald commanded armies from beyond reality itself. Entities of such power that the Scourge's false death crumbled before them. They fell to their knees in worship, praising the void and its chosen instrument. The Ebon Blade responded with professional shock, their warriors pulling back to defensive positions as they reassessed the battlefield. Darian watched Cocytus tear through Scourge forces with efficiency that bordered on artistic, and his tactical mind recognized immediately that this was not a situation his forces could influence. These new arrivals operated at levels that exceeded conventional military power entirely. "Fall back," he ordered. "We are severely outmatched. Disengage and observe from distance." The battle concluded within minutes of Nazaric's arrival. The Scourge forces, recognizing defeat, attempted to withdraw, but found their retreat cut off by warriors whose speed and coordination eliminated any possibility of escape. The cultists, still prostrating themselves in worship, posed no threat and were ignored. The Ebon Blade withdrew successfully, their discipline allowing them to disengage without triggering pursuit. Silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the dissolution of destroyed Scourge warriors and the continued prayers of ecstatic cultists. Ainz stood among the carnage, his mind utterly blank as he contemplated the magnitude of the disaster that had just unfolded. Cocytus approached with obvious pride, his posture suggesting he expected praise for the successful rescue operation. "Ainz Sama, all hostile forces have been neutralized. The rift remains secure. Your safety has been ensured." From the tree line, Darian watched through magical scrying, his expression thoughtful as he analyzed what he had witnessed. The mysterious warrior commanded forces that defied conventional understanding, entities that wielded power casually exceeding anything the Ebon Blade had encountered outside their battles with the Lich King himself. This was not simply an unusual individual. This was something far more significant. The cultists began erecting new shrines even before the last Scourge warrior had finished dissolving their fervor, amplified beyond measure by what they had witnessed. The Dark Herald had summoned his armies, demonstrating the Void's infinite power and proven beyond all doubt that the old god's return was imminent. Reports would filter out across AzeRoth within days. The Alliance would hear accounts of unknown forces appearing in Ashenvale, wielding power that made conventional military might seem irrelevant. The Horde would receive intelligence describing entities that operated according to principles outside known magical traditions. And across the world, those sensitive to cosmic disturbances would feel the ripples of what had occurred, adding yet another anomaly to the growing list of phenomena that defied explanation. Ainz, standing in the aftermath of the battle he had hoped to avoid, finally allowed himself to acknowledge the complete and absolute truth of his situation. He had lost control entirely. The masquerade was over. And everything that happened from this point forward would cascade from this single moment when Nazaric's power was revealed to a world unprepared to understand it. The only question was whether the resulting chaos would destroy everything or merely reshape it into forms too strange to predict.